The first one is just denial. I can hear the alarm bells, but let's not dig in too deeply to why they're ringing, because then we're going to have to start talking about the stuff that we disagree about, which is the B word, C word. And then you've got the other one, which is, it's awful, but what the hell can I do about it? And of course, in therapy, the big lesson I learned in therapy, which for me, if you're new to the program, is a hugely life-changing experience, was this phrase, the mantra I try to live by is where does your power lie? Where does your power lie? If you spend your life fretting and raging about things over which you have absolutely no control, you will go mad, which is, of course, the business model of the Daily Mail, to go back to Jeanette's parents. That's why they've gone mad, because they spend their life fretting and raging over things over which they have no control. But it's no way to live. Where does your power lie takes us back to Alison's point. It doesn't lie in the ballot box if you are a non-Tory supporting Scot. It just doesn't. But we have to push through that. We have to try to find ways to make it matter, to make a change. And that brings us back to the question, how could you help people hear the alarm bells or even acknowledge their importance and their urgency and what it is they presage? Whew. Back to question number 1, 0345 6060973, which is the number you need to tell me about people who apparently can't hear the alarm bells. Although we haven't found any yet. All we've found is people who can hear the alarm bells but disagree fairly passionately about how important they are or indeed where they're coming from. Rebecca Cook is here now with your headlines. And that's the win, isn't it? 33 after 11 is the time. That's the ultimate win, is that people can hear the alarm bells but they don't think they can do anything about it, which is just manna from heaven for an incompetent or corrupt government, isn't it? If you were an incompetent or corrupt politician, or both, incompetent and corrupt, it kind of goes hand in hand. What's your dream electorate? The dream electorate doesn't think they can do anything about anything. Just go along with it. With a fat side order of people who think all of the alternatives are awful because every newspaper they open or every programme they ever turn on is telling them that all the alternatives are awful. It is 33 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of how can anyone be ignoring these alarm bells has not yet been answered. We're hearing about people perhaps disagreeing about what the alarm bells are. So let's kick it into the realms of politics, Westminster politics, Conservative Party politics. How can the Conservative leadership election be conducted in a way that suggests Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss can't really hear these alarm bells that are ringing like the clappers for the rest of us? They make noises about tax cuts and the cost of living, and Rishi Sunak is getting increasingly robust in his criticism of Liz Truss. Conservative commentators in the newspapers at the weekend, most obviously Matthew Parris in the Times, describing her in the most caustic of terms. I mean, for my money, swingingly accurate, but so caustic for Conservative supporting, Liz Truss supporting readers of the Times. They can't even hear that alarm bell about what they're doing. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. How can these politicians, tweeting at the weekend, for example, about how voting against making water companies do more to deal with raw sewage had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that water companies are not doing more to deal with raw sewage? How can they be so detached from the reality that the rest of us recognise? And you don't have to be living it. I'm not living it. I'm better protected against the looming crises than most people. Not everybody, but most people. But I'm acutely aware of it. And not just because of what I do for a living. When I was at the football, people coming over to me, by dint of being able to afford to be in that room, are not going to be in the front line of pain and misery. But their employees might be, their businesses might be, their energy bills commercially will be. And yet, you look at Truss and you look at Sunak and you look at the rest of them, Ian Duncan Smith or Jacob Rees-Mogg or whoever it may be, John Redwood, they can't hear any alarm bells. And when you point out the alarm bells to them, do you know what they say? I don't know if you ever debase yourself by opening up the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph, but quite often you'll read that, we haven't got enough. We've got too much government. The regulation's gone wrong. But we also need less regulation at the same time, as we look at the consequences of the levels of regulation that we've already got. It's absolutely bonkers. 11:36 is the time. Jez is in Saltburn by the Sea. Jez, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks very much for taking my call. To address the governmental thing, I think with the possible exception of mistrust, I think the government can certainly hear the alarm bells.
Really?
But they know their electorate don't want to hear that. Because their electorate are already on top of the pile. They've been there for a long, long time. And they want the Conservatives, the clues in the name. They want everything to stay the way it's been. They don't want to consider that in 30 or 40 years' time there won't be as many foreign holidays as there are now. They're looking at the email that came the other day from Octopus saying these troubles will hopefully last 2 years.
Yes.
So the fuel crisis will be over. They're hoping that the Brexit thing will sort itself out. It's what you mentioned in the first half hour. People cannot look long term. They want short term fixes and fixes they can see in their lifetime and preferably within this Parliament. So they want to be told things aren't that bad. Everything's okay. We'll put it right. Just get up in the morning, keep doing what you do.
And that is a sympathetic analysis in a way, because we're all human and we don't like being frightened or we don't like being fearful. And if we can insulate ourselves from it, then there is a very strong, almost primal urge to do so. I don't want to look over there. It's scary. I'm going to look over here instead. Yeah. I like what I can see over here. And of course, that means I'm going to give support to the people who are telling me the nice things rather than the people who are telling me the truth, which describes both British politics and indeed the British media.
And arguably, it's not really possible to live your life in a state of permanent exasperation with the way that everything is falling apart. So you have. So
it's a living, Jez. It's a living.
Yes, true. But once you start doing that, of course, you either become despairing, and I think the word that has been overlooked is despair. I think there's a colossal amount of despair in the country. I even think, and I'll tell you what, the reason why the politicians are not mentioning the Conservative Party, are not mentioning the current alarm bells, is because they know the despair is there as well.
But not in this electorate, though. This is, such a weird little... Oh, you disagree? You think, no, that electorate, the Conservative Party membership electorate, not the electorate. I think, as Alistair Campbell said, you're always going to have your golf club bores. And it's possible those types of a lesser intelligence perhaps are literally in denial because their echo chambers, the Telegraph, the Mail are telling them that there simply aren't problems. But I think people who are trying to tough it out and even believe Boris Johnson, to try and bring him back and believe Truss, I think that they're feeling it. This despair is everywhere. I'm going to disagree with you on that bit. I think I'm going to disagree with you. I'll call his mum watching the news, getting very worried about it, and then saying, I don't want to talk about politics, in a way adds to your theory, supports your theory, because it's the idea that people are conscious, they can hear the alarm bells, they're conscious of the catastrophe, but they don't want to talk about the roots of it or the reasons for it yet, and that suits the Conservatives. And then, of course, the first caller essentially just saying that they won't talk about it anymore. It's gone. But I'm trying to find one for you from someone whose parents. My mum and dad voted Brexit. It's from James. They read the Daily Mail. My sister's a nurse and I work for local government. We've tried to talk to them, but what we get is you just don't know. You're too young. You should respect your elders. And James adds, I'm 43, for goodness sake, and my sister is older than me. That's not being aware of it and looking the other way. That's fingers in the ears, isn't it? That's the sunk cost fallacy, isn't it? Yes. I've committed myself for so long that I can't possibly admit after all these years that I might have been wrong even recently. So that's precisely where you should respect your elders comes from. It's sunk cost. Yeah, because I say so. Well, why, Dad? Why? Yeah. Because I say so. But it's demonstrably untrue. Wrong. And stop challenging me because you're making me feel stupid or silly or
which
ashamed.
Is why if we just open our eyes, we see phrases like, when the facts change, I change my mind. And there's nothing wrong with that. But some people, their eyes aren't, not their eyes, their horizons aren't quite broad enough to encompass that idea. And part of how they brought their own children up was being the patriarch, the matriarch, being right. So even when their child is 43, they're still their child. They can't say, do you know what? I've cocked up all these years. I've got it wrong. I'll tell you what, I wasn't wrong.
Do you know, as you speak,
I am wrong now.
Yeah, no, John Major's trending. I can't quite work out why. I presume he's made some sort of intervention. But as you speak, Julian Suffolk texted to say this is shattering for some people's lifelong worldview.
Precisely. Yeah, that's what it is. It's about identifying your own sense of self with your politics, your ego, your sense of self. It's all wrapped up together. Wrongly, mistakenly.
Of course, wrongly.
But we are taught these days, we all know how pathos is 80% more influential in argument than logos or ethos. So the way people feel, the way that they identify with their feelings and the way they identify with what they've always done,
yes.
when you start to pick at that, you're picking at their sense of self.
And that is why they will really double down on an environment or on politicians who allow them to sustain that sense of self. When Liz Truss talks about tax cuts.
Yeah, and they listen to you and they listen to the press and they see the potential for household fuel bills going to £6,000 a year, and my friend whose wife is Thai, and 3 years back it cost £2,500 for them to visit Thailand with their family. This year it's £6,500, and that's not going to. That's maybe now, but that's not going to come down to where it was.
No,
we're going to have to turn our back on distant foreign holidays within the next decade or two. There was a time when there were no holidays. Then there was a century or so when everyone had weekends away. Then there was a brief 50 years when we all had foreign holidays in Mallorca and Tunisia. And I think we're going to go back to Blackpool, to Brighton.
I don't mind that so much. I mean,
me either. I live in a holiday resort. I live at you.
Of course you do. This is at Saltburn by the Sea tourist office on the line, isn't it?
Yeah. Smaller poo.
No, don't worry. Yeah, oh, God. 11:43 is the time. Thank you, Jez. Yes, and I mean, what I like about those sort of and look, if he's describing you, I doubt you like it. But it's kind, it's generous, it's trying to understand people that you don't agree with and people who are demonstrably wrong. That's the bit I can't help adding. Jez is too diplomatic to it. They are just wrong. It's wrong. Your life's not getting better as a consequence of Brexit. It really isn't. It has got measurably worse, and it's about to get worse again. Not all because of Brexit, obviously, but you can't start fixing these problems or addressing these problems while you're still in denial about them being problems. And that's when you hear people talking about, these wonderful trade deals, or I love it, it's going so well. You know that they're either deluded or in denial. And, of course, even if you wanted to tell me now, well, actually, James, my life's got great. I've had 12 years. I've never been better off. I'm doing brilliantly. Then you're not patriotic, which is the other thing you constantly claim to be with your ludicrous flag avatars and cheering the politicians with pictures of the Queen on the wall. If you are pleased, if you have somehow benefited or you think you've come out on top since 2016, then you're unpatriotic. Because have a look at the country. Stick your head out the window for a minute. Have a look at the cost of living crisis. Have a look at inflation. Compare it to every other country in the G7. Have a look at energy bills. Have a look at what's coming down the tracks. Have a look at it. Just have a look at it. It's about to hit your fellow countrymen and women. So you're happy with the way things have gone? Then you are either a liar or profoundly unpatriotic. I'd go so far as to say treacherous. You're happy with how things have gone since 2016. You're telling me you're happy, then you're either a liar or a traitor. And by traitor, I simply mean someone who betrays the national interest, someone who is not caring about the national interest, who cares entirely about themselves. In fact, you probably run a water company. It is 11:47. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That last text from Julie, writes Steve, sounded like it came from me. I'm 46. I've never been right about politics in my life, according to my mum. She was a Conservative local councillor in the 1980s. Make of that what you will. So you look at the country now, and the 12 years of Tory rule is crucial to this. You look at what's happening now. You register the alarm bells, and you simply can't acknowledge the truth because it undermines who you think you are. It undermines your sense of self, your identity. When I came up with the word footballification to describe what had happened, I thought relatively recently to British politics, Brexit, really. I was being a bit thick, wasn't I? It's actually been going on for decades. Possibly it's always been there. It's always been like this. How likely were people to shift from Whig to Tory back in the day? I don't know. I presume there was more fluidity, more electoral fluidity, more democratic fluidity in previous generations. And it's this weaponization of political tribalism that has created the biggest problems, and one thinks of the Daily Mail and Rupert Murdoch's son and others, but I don't know, actually. Maybe this has always been what holds us back and keeps the status quo in place. Although, to be honest, there was probably a bit of a clue. If you decided to call your political party Conservative, it suggests you're quite keen to conserve things exactly the way that they are. And so if you're looking at what 12 years of conservatism has delivered, and you're seeing care homes, hospitals, cost of living, energy bills, sewage, everywhere you look, it's catastrophic. What choice have you got but to close your eyes and stick your fingers in your ears? I mean that almost charitably. What's the alternative? To realise that you have been wrong about everything for your entire life. That's why social media is getting weird now. Very weird. It's always quite weird. But, I mean, what do you do? So look at the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph. We need a complete system reset. This is the same people who've spent 12 years telling you that the people in charge are the absolute dons. It's just bizarre. But the self-delusion is key to understanding this process, I think, rather than the notion of deluding other people. You have to keep lying to yourself to keep that sense of self-sustain. I don't know. Richard's in Northampton. Richard, what do you think?
Hi, James. I'd preface this conversation with the fact that I did vote Tory in the last election.
You don't. I mean, there's nothing. You don't have to do that. But I suppose it makes your perspective more interesting than mine. I'll give you that.
It's more that a feeling of guilt in terms of my.
You weren't spoiled for choice, were you?
Well, no, but I think it's more for the fact that my care for the fellow man.
Yes, okay.
In that I'm seeing what's unfolding now, and I think it's just so tragic that there are people that have done extremely well over the last 6 years, and especially over the pandemic. I work in hospitality, and unfortunately I was furloughed and then made redundant during that period.
I'm sorry.
But I've since come back, and I'm still in hospitality and very, very much enjoying my job. But I come across other business owners and people in that circle that have done extremely well and are doing very well. And I've almost got this, well, I'm all right, Jack, attitude. Yeah. Everything's good for me. I've got a final salary pension scheme for when I retire. I've got plenty of money in the bank. And quite frankly, I don't care.
That's the big divide, I think, is it, for you? That the people who just got in at the end of the good old days, as it were, and are going to be all right until... And that's going to make up a huge proportion, one imagines, of the Conservative Party membership, but not necessarily the nationwide electorate. Yeah,
I mean, what highlighted it to me, it was I went to see a customer on Friday, and this guy came in, another supplier, a guy in his 60s, and my customer was saying, I'm really struggling. I just can't get any staff. Mm. So I'd never met this guy before, and I just piped in. Well, it didn't help that we obviously voted for Brexit, and lots of people have gone home that were working in the warehouse trade, and lots of people from hospitality have now moved into those roles at warehousing because it's far better paid.
Right.
And he goes, oh, you're one of those Ramonas, are you?
Still doing that now.
Yeah. I said, well, I'm moaning because it's created so many problems for multiple sectors, whether it be transportation, hospitality, everywhere. And he was a supplier to the hospitality trade. So I was thinking, well, it can't be great for your business if your customers can't get staff, they're going to go out of business. But
he won't join the dots. So he won't deny that his clients are struggling. I mean, in some cases, we've spoken to people who are closing more shifts, more services than they want to. You know, they're closing on Mondays and Tuesdays when previously it was only Mondays, and people who are doing fewer covers, even in big restaurants, you know, household name restaurants we've spoken to who are doing fewer covers now because they need to guarantee a level of service that they can't do with lower levels of staffing. So he can't deny that. That's not an opinion, that's counting, but he will refuse to countenance that it's a consequence of Brexit.
Absolutely. I've got many customers that are now closed on a Monday and Tuesday because of staffing. Yeah. But their fixed costs have not changed at all. So their lease and the rent is the same. All their costs in terms of providing staff shifts, they haven't dropped. So, but he then went off on a right go at me.
Go on.
As I said, it was the first time I've ever met this guy.
Yeah, they're spooked now. They're angry and they're scared. And you would have just pushed that button when you said that. The internal dialogue that he's finally getting around to having with himself comes bubbling to the surface.
Yeah, and I said, well, and then he went and said, oh, well, I want all these Eastern European lorry drivers off the road. That hasn't happened either. Aston, hold on a second, we've got a shortage of lorry drivers. We need as many as we can to come in.
Good Lord.
I thought the whole irony it was my wife works in the NHS, and I just thought, because he said to me, and I want to see less brown faces around. Well, the irony is the NHS is very much relying now on West Africa and the Philippines.
Philippines in particular, and I know that, I mean, I spoke to people quite famously who would say things like, I'm voting for Brexit, or I voted for Brexit because there's too many brown faces behind the tills in Tesco. And if that really was your motivation, and part of me wants to add at this point, at least you were honest about it, instead of pretending that you were interested in sovereignty or whatever other nonsense you've subsequently served up, then you've got the polar opposite of what you thought you were voting for. And I'm never going to feel sorry for a racist. But in a purely logical deduction, the idea that you voted to have fewer brown faces in your health service and now you're going to have lots more is it's not exactly what you'd call a win, is it? Thank you, Richard. Do you want to know? Well, you probably know this already, Richard, but seeing as you're in Northampton, I am planning on cycling from Birmingham to Brentford.
Okay.
And I have to turn left at Northampton.
Okay, well, pop in for a coffee.
Yeah, just to give you a heads up, I might need a bed for the night. 11:55. I only looked at the map this morning. I came up with the idea yesterday. I was going to go from Brentford to Birmingham, but actually I got as far as Hamwell and had a really nice pint in a pub called the Fox. I don't know if you've ever been to the Fox in Hamwell. It's a lovely pub. And then I cycled back to Brentford, and actually it's a bit downhill. And then I suddenly thought, of course it's a bit downhill. That's what locks are for. I appreciate this is a bit partridge, but nevertheless, I've still got the thrill of discovery. Fresh. That's what locks are for. You think, well, it can't be a hill. You can't be going faster on your way back than you were on the way there. It's a canal. There's about 4 locks on that stretch of the Grand Union Canal, so of course I was going downhill on the way back, and it took about a third of the time. So I slightly rejigged my plan of cycling from Brentford to Birmingham, and instead I'm going to go from Birmingham to Brentford. But the reason I mentioned Northampton is that if I swing a left in Northampton, I reckon I can get all the way to Kidderminster along the canals. And I know there's not going to be lovely chintzy towpaths all the way, and I'll probably have to slide off and go on there. But this is something I'm going to do before I'm 55. 60, 65, 650. Soon. I shall cycle all the way from Kidderminster to Brentford. You've got to set yourself these goals. 11:56 is the time. Thank you, Richard. Wondering what the hell this bloke on the radio is talking. I rang in to talk about flipping the economy. And he's something about canals. Matthew's in Liverpool. Matthew, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on your alarm bells analogy and sort of talk about some of my perspective.
Yeah.
So my partner's family, I think, frankly, cannot hear them at all.
Really?
Yeah, so a couple of months back, before April, my partner was calling on the phone to her sister. It was the first she'd heard of the energy crisis. Never heard of it. She mentioned it. My partner, she's just not heard of it at all. She just sort of said, "Oh, well, everything goes up in April, doesn't it?"
So she hadn't got the bills through yet?
I presume if she's on a fixed contract with a energy supply that hadn't gone bust, she wouldn't have. She'd still be on a fixed contract.
It just completely passed her by.
Yeah, and I don't think it's because I don't say anything disparaging about the family. I don't think it's because of ignorance.
I wouldn't want you to. But that's just head in the sand stuff. That's not like fingers in ears, eyes closed. That's just lights. That's just not looking out the window.
Yeah, and I think it's just genuinely because she works a pretty difficult job. She works all the hours God sends. She says she only gets 3 hours of sleep a night. And I think what sometimes we don't appreciate is maybe, and I certainly know I do follow a lot of this stuff quite closely, but a lot of people just don't. Like you
so what happens to them? When does the wake-up call come then for them?
Well, I mean, we've sort of been trying to tell her a bit about it. Like, this is something you might want to keep an eye on. But
how well off is she?
Not very. She works, just does a minimum wage service job.
Okay, this is quite important, and you're right, because of what I do for a living, I probably overlook this. I always speaking to people who are by definition engaged because they're listening to LBC. So she's just not really got much of an inkling yet about what's going to happen if inflation and energy bills combine with cost of living to make her current life almost unsustainable. Or if not almost, I mean, actually unsustainable.
Yeah, I think she just genuinely doesn't have the time and energy to dedicate to stuff like that. And it's difficult because
she's busy getting on with it. She's busy getting on with it.
There's so many things that all add up together, and compile and compound. And he says, well, it's not just energy. It's, what you've been talking about, the water with the bin lorry drivers in Scotland, teachers, barristers. There's so much that all comes together. And it is. I genuinely think it is difficult for.
I think you're right. I think that's the perfect conclusion to this conversation, actually. And a very, very timely and necessary reminder that just because we immerse ourselves in this nonsense all day and every day doesn't mean that everybody else does. And sit here baffled by the failure of people to heed alarm bells is because they genuinely can't hear them, which means we're not ringing them loud enough, actually. I think I'll let myself off the hook on that particular one. I don't know what else I can do. But in terms of finding out a family member isn't aware, it's crazy, right? It's absolutely crazy. But here we are, staring down the rail tracks and wondering whether the light at the end of the tunnel is actually a freight train coming towards us at 100 miles an hour. It's coming up to 12 noon. So, stay tuned to find out what I'm going to talk about next. I'm quite keen to talk about the care homes, but on the other hand, we all need cheering up, which I'm not going to put any pressure on him, but it's quite a good day to have John Cleese as a studio guest at 12:45. I hope he's in a good mood. I might have reached peak Partridge with this, but I'm sticking with it. Unfortunately, Mr. O'Brien, writes Roger, canals go uphill and down. The Grand Union goes uphill to Tring and then down to Milton Keynes. From there, it's up and down all the way to Birmingham. About 90% of the towpath is acceptable, although personally I travel by narrowboat. If you're just tuning in, you better get used to this. I'm going to be doing a lot of canal-based chat in the coming... Don't do that. Don't put your actual head in your hands while you're producing the programme. That's really not very good for morale. Talent management, it's a huge part of your brief. I am going to be doing a lot of canal-based chat in the coming months and possibly years. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. So we're not going to talk about care homes. Put it back in the fridge. Talk about it later in the week. Because I think the story about barristers is pretty big. And in fact, following on from the last caller, which has prompted quite a lot of response, the completely neglected constituency of people who are really not aware of what is happening or not aware of what is coming down the line. It's tallied with a lot of your experiences. One in particular I thought put it very well. I won't be able to find it now. Here it is from Emma, who works for a children's charity. And she writes, your current caller's point is so important. We work with so many families and they are divided between being absolutely terrified about the winter or not knowing at all about what is coming, both concerning in their own ways, which is not a children's charity, just a charity working to end poverty called First Days. That's it, isn't it? I mean, that constituency of people that don't know yet about what's heading towards them. Woof. Not so much that they are ignoring the alarm bells, but that they can't hear them. So anyway, the story about barristers. The reason I mentioned the last call to the programme about not being aware of the problem is because I kind of looked, I thought, oh yeah, I've talked about this with the secret barrister. We know roughly what's going on. It's, whatever. Not bored by it or in any way unconcerned, but just I hadn't fully registered the scale of today's announcement. Barristers have voted to go on an indefinite, uninterrupted strike in England and Wales from next month. This is the Criminal Bar Association. It's going to begin on the 5th of September, roughly the time the new Prime Minister arrives in Downing Street. And what's been going on previously is that members have been striking on alternate weeks in a dispute with the government over pay, working conditions and legal aid funding. This is, arguably huge. Well, not arguably. This is absolutely huge, but arguably a mistake because... This is the problem with industrial action, right? The more impact it has, the more effective it is. Any form of protest, actually, whether you're sitting down in the middle of the M25 to draw attention to the need to insulate houses or stop using fossil fuels, or whether you are downing tools on the railways or in the courts, the bigger the impact, the more effective the action. But then you have the corollary, is that the right word? The corollary of that is that the bigger the impact, the more likely it is that you might lose public support because of the people upon whom you are having the impact. How long do you reckon, if you feel mildly warm towards the RMT at the moment, or ASLEF, how muffed up would your life have to be before your mild support, or even your passionate support, begins to diminish? Do you see what I mean? And with the barristers, what I find fascinating about this industrial action is that very few of us, relatively speaking, disproportionately speaking, very few of us will feel this. Unless you've got a court date or unless you have a court case unfolding, I don't think it's going to touch the sides. Is it? And it's a weird one because imagine if you needed one tomorrow. It's like the safety net. My dad always used to talk to me when my dad got made redundant by the Daily Telegraph in 1990. And he went to sign on. And I was like, Dad, you don't need to sign on. You shouldn't be signing on. And I was embarrassed. I was a priggish public school boy and I didn't think that sort of thing happened to people like us. And it was a bit of a culture shock. And Dad was like, son, it's a safety net. It's there. It's there to I've been paying into it all since I was 15 years old. And they're going to give me some advice about this, that and the other. And we're going to... It's my right. There's no embarrassment attached to it. It's got nothing to do with whether we can afford it or not. It's what you do, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's there in case you need it. So much of what you would describe as infrastructure is there in case you need it. The army is there in case you need it. The police service is there in case you need it. And in this case, the legal system, the judiciary, the courts are there in case you need them. And you know what I think of at this point, don't you? If you think it's gone peak partridge already, you're in for a treat. I always think of gully suckers. I first started doing shifts on LBC a long, long time ago when we were in a damp cellar on Gray's Inn Road, not this fantastic state-of-the-art, HD or whatever it is, studios that we sit in now. We were in a really damp cellar with sort of stains on the wall in the basement of Gray's Inn Road. And all the sort of fellas upstairs, Channel 4 News and ITN, they sort of treated us like like janitors almost. And I took a call from someone, and I think we were talking about, I think Gary got there first, 12:08, 12:09. Yeah, you did, just by about 30 seconds, Gary. Mate, you listen too closely to this programme. It's gully suckers. And I took a call about flooding, appropriately enough. We're talking about water-related issues back then. And someone rang in and said, I'll tell you what, James, it's because we got rid of the gully suckers. And I said, I beg your pardon. They said, we got rid of the gully suckers. The local council used to have machines, big engines, that would clean out the gutters. Not every day or even every month, but every now and then they would clean out the gutters. And I think they used to have snowplows stuck to the front of them so that they were dual purpose. And the council had the staff who wouldn't be dedicated, but they'd be redeployed. And when there was needs for a snowplow, they'd stick a plough on the front of it. And when there was needs to clean out the gutters, they'd get the hoses out and they'd just suck the gullies, right? Gully sucker. It's there in case you need it. But you want to save a few quid, you get rid of it. That's only gone out 8 days in the last year. We don't need that. And then you wonder why you've got flooding or why you've got roads being brought to a complete standstill by heavy snowfall. An awful lot of infrastructure, from the relatively silly or trivial, like gully suckers, to the hugely important, like armies, they're there in case you need them. And another problem with the economic model that we've been speaking about for 2 hours this morning is that if you have prioritised profit or cost savings, which is in many ways the same thing, the more you save, the more you get to keep, the more you do away with the stuff that's only there in case we need it. Because if you don't need it today and you don't need it tomorrow and you don't need it the day after, then by the end of the week you could probably be persuaded that we should get rid of it. And that's just something that worries me slightly about the walkout. 70 Crown Courts across England and Wales are going to be brought to an effective standstill. Now, there's a good analysis here from the Beebs Home and Legal correspondent, but where he literally addresses the question I've just asked you. Given very few of us ever see the inside of a courtroom, why does this matter? And the short answer is that everybody, including victims, will be left in limbo, unsure whether they will ever see justice. So I need to speak to barristers about this. I urge you to listen to my full disclosure episode with the secret barrister who spoke in some depth about why this was likely to happen and why it was necessary. But I'd love to hear from you. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Why is this going ahead? Why is this legal action? Why is this industrial action going ahead? Why are you, as a barrister, going on strike? 0345 6060 973. And then the tricky bit, why do you support it as someone who's not a barrister? Because I think you probably don't. I think you either don't know enough about it, or you don't think of barristers as professionals in need of more support or more help. The details, some of the numbers that I hope we hear, because I'm banking on barristers not being in court at the moment and being able to ring in and give the rest of us a heads up. Some of the detail that I have read about what's happened to the legal profession, about criminal justice in particular, legal aid barristers and the like, it will actually make your hair fall out. It is quite incredible what has been done to the legal system in this country. If it is anywhere near as bad as I believe it to be, then that invites our most common question, the question we most frequently ask, whatever the subject may be, which is, how has this happened? Why would this happen? How could a government or any political party want to preside over a diminished, diluted legal system? I know this particular government's got a problem with lawyers. That's inevitable because they've got a big problem with the law. Whether that changes or not when we replace the law-breaking liar Boris Johnson with the law-breaking liar's most enthusiastic cheerleader Liz Truss, we'll have to wait and see. But I'm not baffled by this government's problem with lawyers, because this government has problems with laws, both domestic and international. But in the great scheme of things, I guess I don't think it's deliberate. I think it might have happened a bit by accident, because it makes no sense. You and I could, right now, at any point in the next day, anyone we're related to, anyone we love, anyone we know, could be a victim of crime. Why would anybody seek to diminish or dilute the system which would give us our only chance of justice? So I want to know how bad it is for barristers. 0345 6060 973. If you know any, give them a ring, get them to call in. I want to know how bad it is for barristers, right? But I also want to know how this has happened. I was first warned about this by a friend of the family, a barrister friend of the family. He's retired now. We're going back about 10 years. My dad was still alive. And he was explaining to me why he was going to retire early, because it wasn't going to be worth his while to continue. And I didn't fully register. I didn't quite beep. The old alarm bells didn't quite go off enough, because I don't understand the motivation or the rationale for doing something. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be this bad. Maybe there were supposed to be incremental changes that you might be able to justify, but it's all gone too far. It's all gone too deep. I want to know why barristers are going on strike, which is a shorthand way of asking what's so bad about being a barrister. 0345 6060 973. I want to know the political context in which this has happened, because it seems like a bonkers development. What possible political gain can there be from undermining the criminal justice system? 0345 6060 973. And then I kind of want to know, I want you to remind everybody else why we should care, if you see what I mean. I'm not planning on breaking any laws anytime soon, or indeed I'm quite naively confident I'm not going to be a victim of crime anytime soon. How do you elevate this industrial action to a level of importance that you get, for example, when railway workers go on strike? Given that most of us, or millions of us, need the railways every day, we don't need the criminal justice system every day. So how do we join those dots? And an early mention to Nigel, who says, where will we get our coffee if all the barristers go on strike? Well done, Nigel. It's 12:16. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 3 questions for you there. Crucially, I think, first up will be, why are you on strike? What is it that's so bad about your profession that is prompting you to take this reluctant but unprecedented action? 0345 6060 973. 12:19 is the time. And then there's the worry about the quantity of crisis rather than perhaps the quality of crisis. The notion of barristers going on an indefinite, uninterrupted strike in England and Wales in normal circumstances would stop all the clocks. But given that it is happening against a backdrop of nationwide crises in all manner of sectors, I wonder whether we properly appreciate the scale of the issue. So we'll find out by asking and indeed answering the questions that I ran you through a moment ago. Stephen is in Coulsdon to kick things off. Stephen, why is this happening? Why are you going on strike?
Well, James, there's been a systematic level of underfunding in the criminal justice system for years. In fact, across both parties, Labour and Conservative, and we've now reached breaking point, not just in terms of remuneration for barristers, but the places where we conduct our work. If you go to many court centres, there are no cafeterias. You've got leaking roofs. You've got courtrooms that don't run efficiently in the winter with the heating, or too hot in the summer. I mean, it's just an embarrassment to say that we have the greatest criminal justice system in the world, but it's just creaking under the pressure of lack of investment, James.
I think I've spotted one early flaw in my questioning, which is it's quite obvious why successive governments would have done this, because they were trying to save money.
Well, yeah, but, the criminal justice system, a bit like the NHS, it needs the proper investment for it to run efficiently, because anybody could be a victim or a suspect in the criminal justice system, and we'd like to think that if we were, it would run efficiently and justice would be done. It would be seen to be done by people who've trained many years to practice the field of law. And, James, I want to say also that when people talk about barristers, let's be precise. We are not talking about commercial barristers, trust barristers, shipping barristers. We're talking about people who do public-funded work, criminal legal aid barristers. There's a huge chasm. There's a huge difference between those doing that kind of work and those who do privately funded work.
And, of course, that's where the money comes from to pay the different categories as well. This is taxpayers' money, to coin a phrase. So this is quite an interesting tweet from No Hostages. What possible gain could there be from undermining the justice system by paying barristers less than the living wage? You could ask the same about care workers in the social care system, or teaching assistants in the education system, or soldiers or nurses. The point is simply to keep corporate and personal taxation low.
Well, that may be an argument, but I mean, each profession will have its own argument in respect of how much it is paid. Certainly in the current crisis where inflation is rising rapidly, but we as a profession have been underfunded for years, and most of the work we've done has been on the goodwill of keeping the criminal justice system running. So barristers working late into the night to ensure that cases are ready to run the next day.
Can you talk us through the detail of that? How long have you been a barrister, if you don't mind me asking?
I've been a barrister now for 30 years, James.
Okay, and when you started compared to now, just sort of a thumbnail sketch, including pound signs, if you can. You don't have to. Someone else will.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, when I started, we were just on the back end of barristers who were in the doing criminal legal aid work, who arguably had done quite well. People call it the gravy train, but it wasn't a gravy train to the extent that people were making millions of pounds. But certainly when I started, let's put it this way, to train as a barrister, it was about £3,500. It's now £15,000. I remember going to court in the early days for £30 a day when I first started. And of course, fees did increase as I became more experienced. But even now, for the kind of work that we are doing and the hours that we work, the remuneration is not commensurate with that. And of course, people forget we're self-employed. We also pay tax. We also pay clerks' fees. We don't get paid for travel, often travelling outside London. And many of the preliminary hearings that we do, people are paid as little as £46.50, £100 for a preliminary hearing, where often you've had to travel miles to do a court hearing for less than half an hour. Things are changing because we're using technology more, but that's the reality of it.
What does success look like? Well, I mean, because this government is probably the least lawyer-friendly government I can remember. You're closer to the action than I am. You might disagree. I mean, the leader of the opposition is a former barrister, but so was Tony Blair, who you mentioned as being part of the process rather than part of necessarily of the solution. So what are you asking for? What would signal an end to the industrial action?
Well, I think the figure of 25% that they're asking for now, rather than the 15%, which is only applicable to cases from the end of September, I think, and not retrospective, would put us in a position of, for all the years where we hadn't received fees, a fee increase. and we say that's proper and fair remuneration for the work that we do. We're not looking to become rich.
No.
There are barristers who do well, who represent people like the likes of Eccleston, who pay privately.
Of course.
But a majority of people are representing those who are eligible for legal aid because they can't fund their own court cases, and barristers who conduct those cases on behalf of either the prosecution or the defence are simply asking to be remunerated fairly and properly for the work that we do in the courtroom and outside.
I understand all of this. I'm not, and I hope I'm wrong, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way. I'm not very optimistic about your cause, you know. I had Mick Lynch in here on Friday, and it's so much more easily digested, the plight of the railway worker or the situation of the railway worker than the plight of the barrister, because it's in our minds all the time, and that very few people spend much time thinking about Crown Courts or the justice system. I know they should. I'm not describing the world I want to live in. I think I'm describing the world I do live in. It's this notion of impact. What does impact look like? What how do you make people realise how important this is and how unfair your treatment is?
Well, by it being publicised, by people like me coming on to give the true reality of what it means to be in practice. And also, we remember that most people who watch all these TV dramas on our televisions about courtrooms, well, they should start visiting their local courtrooms to see what happens, because at any one time in your life, you or a loved one could be involved in the criminal justice system, either as a suspect or as the victim. And then you'll realise the worth of having a barrister who is able to articulate your case and argue your case, irrespective of which side. We train hard, we train long, and it doesn't mean because we are perhaps articulate or wear nice suits to court that we're making lots of money. And
I guess the need for the sort of work that you do becomes more acute the less you have, in a sense, in you know, as with everything else where you can afford to pay or you can't afford to pay. It's going to be the people most in need of help and most vulnerable who are hurt most by what you describe. Stephen, thank you. I wish you luck on this. The more I talk about it and the more I think about it, the more I wonder whether it is relatively unlikely to succeed. I don't know. That's why I need to find out more. Let's talk to Isabel, who's in Jaén in Spain. Isabel, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, originally it was your point at the beginning of this segment where you were talking about how the criminal justice system is a sort of one-off possible purchase for some people, in the sense they might need a defence solicitor. And I said to your researcher, but it's the prosecution barristers as well.
Of course
and
it is.
Of course, you've had a barrister on now, and I've heard him, and he's put all that argument forward. But it has a knock-on effect on prisons and the probation service and the police, if they just can't get the people processed, if you understand what I mean.
I do, and it's just occurred to me, one line of attack that should be deployed is if you know, tabloid newspapers can get people in a right old tizzy, can't they, about weak sentences. It's usually almost always a myth, but it's a popular tabloid myth. So really, it should be easy to inflame the same people by telling them about wrong uns not facing any justice at all.
Indeed, and you're pessimistic about how successful this protest is likely to be.
I'm pessimistic about public engagement with it, which I presume is a prerequisite of success, but I could easily be wrong.
I see it possibly as a cumulative effect.
Yes.
That so many things are going wrong, and now it's the criminal justice system as well. And it's a cumulative effect that people might start to ask questions about. Maybe. Yeah.
And I mean, then the problem becomes, because of all the other stuff coming on, this may not get the attention that it deserves. Gary in Darlington says law is what binds a society together, and then he swears, quite understandably, because you're probably getting it from my own attempts to navigate this territory, is I don't understand really how it would be in the politicians' interests to undermine a legal system, except insofar as it saves money. And legal aid, and indeed prosecution, CPS, wages and salaries are paid from the public purse. But how could having less justice be politically advantageous? That's the bit I don't get. It's the bit I genuinely can't get my head around. It reminds me slightly of when Boris Johnson was closing fire stations, and I said, look, it can't be as bad as everybody says, because he lives in London and his house could catch fire too. And then someone pointed out to me that the likelihood of you needing a fire appliance in your street or in your home is, like everything else, linked to wealth, and poorer areas of town, as we saw with Grenfell Tower, are a lot more susceptible to fire than richer areas of town. So the wealthier you are, the more insulated you are. Then ask the question of how could wealthy-ish politicians think about legal aid as being something we could do without? Answer is quite straightforward, because it's never going to affect them or indeed perhaps the people who voted for them. 12:30 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Where do you, as an ordinary punter, stand when barristers when you tot up what they get for a case and what they are paid and divide it by the amount of hours that they do, they are often on less than the national living wage. You have to read or listen to my interview with the secret barrister to get your head around what I still think you will find an almost unbelievable fact. Less than the national living wage. This is barristers, people who we think of wrongly as being wealthy, because the ones defending Bernie Ecclestone or prosecuting Bernie Ecclestone, the ones in other sectors, will be paid a fortune. But in legal aid, the burglars, the muggers, the people most likely to impinge upon our lives, when they go to court, the people prosecuting them and the people defending them, because remember, people are wrongly accused. You could be wrongly accused. When they go on strike, how do they reach your heartstrings? What would make you supportive of industrial action being taken by barristers? Or have I just got it all completely wrong? And actually, you do understand the issues and you are broadly receptive to their calls for your support. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. I'll tell you what's bothering me. 12:34 is the time. What's bothering me is that I have a sense of this being huge, and I can't articulate it to you. Now, it's not like we're talking about industrial action on the railways or something, where I might somewhat patronisingly think that because I do this for a living, I'm good at communicating, and then you meet someone like Mick Lynch who can chew up and spit out pretty much every interviewer in the country before breakfast. So barristers are brilliant at making cases. I mean, some are good, some are bad. It's like any other profession. But their job is to make a case, right? Barristers' job is to make a case. I think this is a hugely compelling case. I think in other countries this will be reported and it quite rightly is leading our bulletins. But I think it's international news when a huge swathe of our criminal justice system downs tools. An indefinite, uninterrupted strike in England and Wales by members of the Criminal Bar Association. That's huge. And it's an industrial action being undertaken by people whose professional skill set is dedicated to making a compelling case. But the reason I'm so troubled this afternoon is because as a resident of this country who clearly understands the importance of criminal justice, and some of these new barristers now are earning about $9,000 a year once all their overheads have been taken away. As someone who I just don't know how you communicate it. If barristers can't get their case across, then who can? 0345 6060 973. So why, I suppose I'm asking, why is this not registered? I can't do that. It's kryptonite for a radio fan. And why is this not registering with you? Why don't you care more? But do you understand what I mean? In the words of Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Imagine you need legal aid a year down the line, or you need a prosecution. You need someone to prosecute the scumbag who mugged you or you mugged your kids. And you find out that actually it's too late now. The system's completely knackered. That's the point, isn't it? Tom's in Hemel Hempstead. Tom, what would you like to say?
First time caller. So
welcome.
Be gentle.
Of course, always.
As I was saying to your researcher, I think the only time that things will really start to progress for the bastards, when people will become interested,
yes,
are when there are miscarriages of justice, or when defendants are forced to represent themselves.
Is that happening?
Not to a huge extent, but judges are certainly putting pressure on defendants who are representing themselves because they haven't got anyone else to represent them to progress their cases.
And is that because they can't? That's because there is a shortage of barristers.
Yes.
Right.
But
And that's only
probably
going to
the
get worse
biggest
as this continues.
It's a tricky one.
But this is the Joni Mitchell conundrum, Tom. You don't know what you've got till it's gone, and you don't know it's gone until you need it, and when you need it, it's gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
But can I just say the biggest problem that I see is when there are defendants in custody awaiting trial, their custody time limits expire because, we're not living in the country yet where we can keep people locked up indefinitely.
Don't give them ideas.
And judges have no option but to release them pending their trial.
Now, that's something that the tabloid newspapers should be going bonkers about, given how cross they can get about, deliberately misrepresented sentencing. The idea of an accused going free because the clock has run out.
Yes.
Well, why is that not getting more traction?
Because people in general aren't interested in the plight of defence lawyers because, and this may be controversial...
Go on, you're a solicitor, I presume. Are you a criminal defence solicitor?
I am, yes.
Yes, sorry, carry on.
My view is that the general public don't have much time for people that end up as defendants in the criminal justice system.
Right.
There's so many other things.
Which is why they need to keep stressing that this is also prosecution lawyers.
Yes.
Because you can say, well, these scroats don't deserve a defence, but they flipping well deserve to be prosecuted, and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And people with any modicum of intelligence understand that.
Yeah.
Well, but it's not something that's highlighted in the tabloid papers because it doesn't make good reading for most people.
No, and yet the idea of that accused going free because they couldn't get a defence. I mean, it's a question of the lesser of two evils, isn't it? They don't really care about whether you get a defence or not because, things. But the idea of that accused person going free because the clock's run out because there aren't enough barristers to go around, that could easily be used to incite or excite them, but it won't be because I don't fully understand why it won't be, but it is because there's no sort of red meat short-term gain for the tabloids in doing it, and their political clients want them to. They like the idea of winding this down. Is it under existential threat, Tom? Because you've got one foot in and one foot out. Your livelihood depends on them, and vice versa. You've got full sympathy for the strike, have you? You really feel that breaking point has been reached? I
do, but I don't. I'm pessimistic about its outcome.
Yeah, same. And you're a lot more qualified than I am. But it's oddly reassuring to at least think that I'm not blowing in the wind. Thank you, Tom. Raymond's in Vauxhall. Raymond, what would you like to say?
Hello, yeah, I'm also a first-time caller, James. I called in actually in response to another lawyer that you had on a bit earlier who was trying to, I sort of drew from his comments that he was trying to draw a comparison between the NHS service and, effectively the legal aid and criminal justice.
I think that was me.
Service.
I think that was me reading out a text, actually, rather than the actual lawyer. But go on anyway.
Well, I mean, the point I wanted to make about that was, I think the reason, I would agree with that sentiment. The NHS is a free at the point of service to all service, public service. And I don't think anybody would object to people getting paid more in the NHS. Now, with criminal justice, with legal aid, if you're, charged of something and you go to court, you're almost certainly the percentage of people that will qualify for legal aid is tiny.
It is.
This country.
Yeah, I think less than $8,000 in savings, isn't it, and about $13,000 in earnings.
Exactly.
So people aren't going to feel they're having something taken away from them with this. Most people.
But equally, I would also make out the point that everyone would know is that the people who take advantage the most of the legal aid service are the people, the repeat offenders, because.
But then this is why we need to turn the telescope around, don't we, and talk about prosecutions rather than defences. Because if we don't sort out the industry, the sector, the system, then there's not going to be prosecutions of these people.
Well, that's something I didn't understand. Maybe you can enlighten me on the comments that were made, because I understood legal aid was only for defence lawyers and defence barristers.
Yeah, but this isn't about legal aid. This is the CPS can't find the barristers to prosecute the cases because the pay and the wages are going to be so low.
Right.
You have to have a bit of parity, I presume, between defence barristers and prosecution barristers. Otherwise, you'd have grounds for appeal. If if the CPS was paying double what I could get on legal aid, then I don't know. I'm thinking out loud as well. But that seems to me to be the trick. It's prosecution barristers and defence barristers that are going on strike, not just defence barristers.
So what I was looking at this is then it's a problem of economics, as it is with all these other points and all these other debates we're having. When I think somebody on your channel had a show about dentists and how there's a lack of NHS dentists, and the reason is that newly qualified dentists, they don't want to do public work, they want to go straight into private, right? Because the pay in the public sector is nothing compared to what they could earn, and actually is quite minuscule for the amount of work involved. I accept that. So what we're talking about really is that we as a country have to find a way of encouraging, but either encouraging or actually making it mandatory for newly qualified to spend some time in the public sector before they go and do private work. And that
might work for dentistry, but it's mate, it's $9,000 a year for a newly qualified criminal barrister. That's vocation. That's not carrot and stick. That just needs to be much, much higher. Full stop.
Yeah, but I mean, a junior doctor gets paid 36 grand for doing 60, 70 hours a week.
But these people they're not even looking at megabucks down the line. If a junior doctor becomes a consultant, then, you know, they're scratch card territory. That's jackpot, quite rightly, for the record. But these careers are not what they were. I mean, it's not. I think you're falling into the trap, if I may, of seeing it through a 30-year-old lens as just a brief apprenticeship before the gravy train arrives. There is no gravy train.
Are you trying to suggest to me that a barrister that's been in the business for 5-6 years is scraping to make ends meet? I find that difficult to believe.
Well, then you've got to read into it more and listen to them more, and listen to them describe what happens to their. And also, if you were accused of something and you could only afford legal aid defence, would you want someone who was treading water before getting on with their real career, or would you want someone who'd been drawn to it for reasons of principle and integrity and belief?
Well, that's what you get, though. If I'm going to be frank with you, James, that's what you've always got.
Answer the question.
Well, I would accept in the same way when I go to hospital, I get a junior doctor learning their trade.
No, junior doctor doesn't mean what you think it means.
But they're learning their trade, is what I'm saying. They're learning their trade. They don't know everything.
The dedicated lawyer, what do you want? They're not learning their trade. They're deciding what to specialise in or where to go next. You've got junior doctors in their 40s. If you want early, just wet behind the ears solicitor, barrister defending you if you're accused of something you didn't do. That's all I'm asking. I know the answer. You know the answer. Let's stop pretending.
No, I would want of course I want the best. I'd want a 200 grand.
You can't have that. You can't have that. So we need to. But you don't want the $9,000 one either, which is why they're taking legal action, industrial action rather, in order to ensure that you don't get the absolute bottom bargain basement representation, while acknowledging that, unless your dad's a billionaire, you're not going to get the 200 grand a week one either. It's just, I don't know. I'm sure you didn't mean to, but there's a sense of, how do these things happen? These things happen because people are very reluctant to ever acknowledge that other people deserve a break or deserve a bit of support, which is why I'm pessimistic about this, because we don't historically think of barristers as being a category of professionals who need looking after. But that's why you've got to look at the numbers. You've got to look at the numbers. Criminal barristers, perceived as highly paid, are simply not. And you might end up, I think the median salary gets up to about 80 grand. But, that's a fraction of what it would have been 30 years ago. 12:46 is the time. Yeah, put the headphones on. There we go. We're live. John Cleese in the studio. How lovely to see you.
Nice to be here. Nice to find you're a decent size. I could never tell whether you were one of those little 5'5" guys like Tom Hollander.
Straight away, alienating huge swathes of my audience with your heightism.
I shall alienate them all. This will be the lowest listening figure you've ever had, James, by 1 o'clock.
We've got 10 minutes together on the radio, and then you're going to record a full disclosure interview podcast with me, which I'm very I'm very excited about. So we should sort of, you spend a lot of your time in LA. What's brought you back to Blighty? Why are you?
Well, I spend a lot of my time everywhere.
Yes.
People say, where do you live? And I say, I live in hotel rooms, and it's absolutely true. I've been in London 3 weeks this year. But if you say where, well, I was in Singapore, then I was going to do shows in Thailand. They got cancelled, so I went to LA because I have 2 daughters there.
Yes.
And I did some writing with one of the daughters, and then I did a tour of Canada and Pacific Northwest, and then I did a tour of Europe, starting in Portugal.
Don't you get tired?
Yes. The trouble about being old is that you feel tired all the time, but you don't know if you're tired or old.
So is
you
it
don't know
exhaustion
whether
or
to
constant?
take a rest or not.
Right.
It's very confusing.
And how often do you take a rest? I mean, you've got your most recent book out, Creativity, A Short and Cheerful Guide. There's a couple of other things we'll touch on briefly that you're working on. I mean, what are you one of those people who can't cope with doing nothing?
No.
Absolutely
no,
not.
There's 2 types of work, James. You know this.
Yes.
There's the work that you do for money, and then there's work that you enjoy doing, which you also get paid for.
Yes,
Right?
okay. Yeah, so the
Two
best is
categories, yeah.
when you get both. The work
When
that
you get both.
Yes.
And at the moment, I've got both. Last night, I was working with a lovely guy called John Dupre. He wrote the music for Wanda, Fish Called Wanda, and he wrote the music for Eric on Spamalot.
Oh, wow.
And we're working on a musical of Fish Called Wanda. That's fun. I really enjoyed working with him. We finished about 7 o'clock Sunday evening, and that was great. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm writing a script with my daughter called Lookalikes, which is about the Hollywood lookalikes. And again, I really enjoy working with her. So that's the best. You know, I'm getting paid, not much, but I'm getting paid and I'm enjoying it. Then there are other things I do, like commercials, which are perfectly pleasant. But
Sure.
You can't pretend they're very interesting.
Or satisfying.
That's right.
Intellectually engaging.
So doing a commercial is like doing a crossword. It's about the same level of involvement, you know.
How much cachet does John Cleese have in getting projects off the ground?
Very little.
No, you must be exaggerating a little bit, because there are so many projects.
Well, I'll tell you a true story. I
Go
was
on.
talking to someone about 3 or 4 months ago who's been in show business for years. And I said to him, you know, I get very few offers in England.
Right.
I said, have I offended anyone? And he said, no, John, look, you're old.
How old are you?
I'm 83 in October.
It's not
You're old and you're white and you're a man.
And there are no avenues
on
open
that,
to you.
On that alone.
You could always go into politics. Doesn't seem to hold you back there.
Oh, no. Well, the nice thing, look, I'm going to be dead soon. And this pleasant prospect, you know, not having to get up every morning, cheers you up. And it also means you don't worry too much about what people think about you, because when you're young, you want everyone to love you. And then as you get older, you realize it's not going to happen.
I'm taking notes for our forthcoming, more in-depth interview. As we'll explore some of these themes a little more. What's going to happen first, The Life of Brian or the Fish Called Wanda stage musical?
Well, The Life of Brian is difficult at the moment because Eric can agree on very little with Michael, Terry, Gilliam, and me.
Right.
The 3 of us. And there's it's kind of locked. And I think it would get blocked if we went ahead with it, which is why I'm going ahead with the.
Oh, that's a shame.
It's just a terrible
Is that
shame.
artistic differences?
Artistic differences and sort of hating each other. Combination
Don't
of the
say that.
two.
This is going to shatter people's illusions. They've been carefully
We're
cherished
human
for decades.
beings, you
of
know.
course you are. But
We've
Terry
been
and Michael
together since '69, so we had our odd disagreements.
And that is very much a collaborative project, Life of Brian, isn't it?
Not so much. No, what happened?
So it's more his than yours.
Say again?
It's more Terry's than yours. I wouldn't have thought.
Well, not really.
No.
You see, when we did it, it was one of the best films I've ever worked on because God smiled on it from the beginning. Yeah. Sometimes that happens. And we loved it, and we felt that it was our best film, and also it's about serious stuff, about following religious leaders.
When I started at Ampleforth, the Benedictine public school, in 1985, it was still banned.
Well, you know, the girl who played Judith Iscariot,
yes,
she became mayor of her town in Wales and debanned it about 30 years after they banned it.
No, it was astonishing.
But it upset people enormously. Now you don't get anything, but I'll tell you something you'll find amusing. I was talking to the potential producers, a Broadway producer, and we had a read-through, and it went terribly well. I changed an awful lot of stuff. And it went terribly well. And then I said to the actors afterwards, is there anything in there that bothers you? And they said, well, yes. I said, what? They said, well, Eric's saying, I want you to call me Loretta. Now, that film's been out, I think, for 45 years. We've never had problems with it before.
Can move from blasphemy
now we can't do that very funny stuff, which is, of course, ahead of its time.
Yes, it is ahead of its time. I'm sure you could do that.
But nobody's worried about the crucifixion anymore. They're all worried about Loretta being a fella.
I don't want to pour fuel on the flames of these disagreements.
Oh, good.
But
please do. It's much more fun.
What's Terry Jones's major objection to the plan, if I may inquire?
Terry.
Who's holding things up?
Eric is on one side and Gilliam Palin and I are on the other. It's all a bit stuck.
What's Eric's major objection?
We're not quite sure.
Oh, really? Just doesn't fancy it?
But I think he was terribly disappointed that what happened at Paramount was that two people at Paramount were very keen to turn Spamalot into a movie. And then they got replaced by two people who were not keen to turn it into a movie. That's why it didn't happen.
So studio shenanigans.
It was a terrible shame.
You can tell how starstruck I am to have John Cleese in the studio. I just brought Terry Jones briefly back to life, which was something of a misspeak.
He died, didn't he?
I do apologise.
Oh, that's right. I know one of the Terrys died. I think it was the wrong one.
Oh, God. Let's talk about A Fish Called Wanda then. When might that see the light of day on a London stage? Or
With a little bit of luck, it could see the light of day this autumn, and we might do it in England.
Will you be in it?
What, in a wheelchair?
Well,
no,
not at all.
No. I don't mind doing stand-up now because you can get away with anything there because you can chat to the audience. But I wouldn't want to do anything that was too demanding or that had anything very physical to do.
So we started the conversation by running through your indefatigability and the fact that you are doing so much, and we're sort of ending it for now because we're about to sit down for a whole hour and do a sort of life and times type conversation with sort of A Fish Called Wanda coming to the stage without John Cleese being in it. He's going to, I don't know, he's going to sit. I think you should. I think you should have a rethink, John.
Archie should be 83.
Yes,
no,
I do.
No, I
who would play your role?
I'll get out of the way, and when we do Life of Brian, that'll all be done by very, very good young comics. And when we had the read-through in New York, I don't know if we'll do it in London or New York, there were 5 performers there who could go straight into that show and be just as good as we were. Because it's very different.
No, of course it is.
Different ending.
Your relish for it seems undimmed.
Yeah, well, there's some of it I really enjoy.
Yes.
I really do. The touring is okay because it's nice to go out in front of an audience who are laughing at you. It makes you feel good. But the travelling's a killer,
Briefly, because we're out of time, the Short and Cheerful Guide, Creativity. Tell people why they should buy it.
Because it's useful for people to know how to have ideas of how to do things better.
Nicely put.
And it can be read in 50 minutes.
It's
a huge plus.
Even more nicely put. It's the 5'5" of books. Which we're going to go off and record full disclosure for this week. So thank you very much.
Great
for
pleasure.
Now, John Cleese. 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 Now, John.
Một nghề bụi phấn rơi rơi uống cho đời hoa thơm quả ngọt. Có một nghề mồ hôi nhỏ giọt lặng lẽ bên ngọn đèn trăng giáo áng. dòng sông cả cuộc